5 horsepower yard machine, nothing fancy. So this mower was free. It was put out by the curb as trash and I picked it up. Question is, why was it put out by the curb? You can tell from looking at it that it's been sitting in a shed or somebody's garage for a long time. Look at that air filter just falling apart. They left it for dead for some reason. We just have to figure out why. There is no fuel in the tank. There is some nasty stuff down in there, left over from after the gasoline evaporated. So we'll have to clean that out. And to do that, we need to take the gas tank off, which means removing a 1/2" bolt right here. And this bolt, which is 3/8. Now the carburetor and tank assembly should slide off. We have to turn the assembly sideways to disconnect it from the linkage. Now we're going to take the carburetor off the gas tank. The carburetor is held onto the gas tank by 5 Phillips head screws, but before I take those out, I'm going to use an old paintbrush and brush off as much dirt as I can, just to keep that dirt from falling down in the tank when I take the carburetor off. Now between the carburetor and the tank, there is a diaphragm and gasket that are going to look just like this. This is an old one. We want to make a note that the diaphragm is down first and then the gasket. And it is a little bit stiff, but I've seen much worse. So we may be able to reuse this diaphragm and gasket after we clean the carburetor and the gas tank. Now looking down through the mouth of the tank, you can see the crud that's probably left over after the gasoline that was in here evaporated. I'll clean that up with some carb spray. I'll also clean the top of the tank. Down in that well, you can see the dirt down there. That's where this pickup tube sets with the screen. You also want to clean the gas cap because there are vent holes on top. One thing to look out for if you're cleaning this style of carburetor is that this spring may come off, this screen may come off, and this inlet where the carburetor hooks onto the intake manifold, there's a retaining ring and an O-ring. Those may come off as well. While we're waiting on the carburetor and gas tank to dry, we can take the spark plug out, see how that looks. And that looks pretty bad. That needs to be cleaned. Now check the gap, which should be 0.03 inches, and that's pretty close. Before I put that plug back in, let's check for sparks. We did have a spark, so that tells us that the ignition coil is good and the plug is good. The 09 tells you the year, which is 2009. 08 tells you the month, which is August. 04 is the day. So August 4th, 2009, that's when this engine was manufactured. Let's see how we're set for oil. We're actually overfilled a little bit, but that's all right. At least we know there's some in there. Also, if you're working on a trash mower or a mower you're not familiar with, I would suggest you look underneath to make sure that there is a blade and that the blade is tight. I have checked this one and the blade is on tight. I've also checked to see if there's a leak around the crank seal, and there is no leak. It is dry. Now, before we put the carburetor and gas tank back on, let's get it cleaned up. Cleaned up pretty well. As you can see, a little bit of rust on the deck, but I can scrape that red paint off and treat the rust and we'll be good to go. Now, let's get the carburetor back on. Before I put the carburetor and gas tank back on, I want to take this housing off that holds the recoil assembly and check the gap between the ignition coil and the flywheel. And there are 3 3/8 inch bolts that hold this housing on. One on this side, one over here, and one in the front. So here's the ignition coil in front of the engine. This wire leads to the spark plug, and there should be a gap right here and here between the ignition coil and the flywheel, a gap that's about the thickness of a business card, or in this case a recipe card. But you can see that I cannot slide that card between the ignition coil and the flywheel. What I want to do to fix that is loosen these 2/4 inch bolts that hold the ignition coil down, pull that coil back, put this card in between, spin the flywheel until the magnetic section is in front of the ignition coil. Then that coil will be drawn in. At that point, we'll tighten the bolts back down, pull the card out, and a proper gap will be set. First thing is loosen these 2 bolts. And you don't have to take them all the way out, just loosen them up. And on the flywheel, I want to find the magnetized section, which is right here. I pull the ignition coil away, put the card in between, turn the flywheel till this section is in front of the ignition coil, and we'll see the coil being drawn in. And now we're good. Now tighten those 2 bolts back down, pull the card out, and the gap is set. Now one more thing we can check. We can take this 1/4 inch bolt out and take off this cover, and we can see the brake or the kill switch. Make sure that operates properly. Let me get some carb spray and spray that off. And now some silicone spray. And some silicone on the linkage and the springs. Now the cover back on. I know I mentioned earlier that I may try to reuse this diaphragm, but the more it dries out, the harder it gets. So I am not going to reuse this. I bought a new diaphragm and gasket kit that also comes with a new screen and spring. And the part number for this kit is 5083. It fits 3 to 5 horsepower Briggs and Stratton engines with this Pulsa Prime style carburetor. So here's the new diaphragm. You can see how flexible that is compared to the old one, how it's misshapen right here in the corner. So out with the old, in with the new, and remember the diaphragm was down first and then the gasket. And even though this primer bulb is old, I don't think it's cracked. I think it's still good. So we'll see. And I have a homemade air filter. Cost me 27 cents to make this. I have a video posted where I show how I made these, and I have it impregnated with oil. So now we can finally put the carburetor back on, and remember the O-ring and snap ring that I mentioned earlier. Make sure those are in place where it slides onto the intake manifold. So I have to turn the assembly sideways to work this pin into that hole. And that can be kind of tricky to do. There we go. Make sure the spacer is in place back here. Get that 1/2 inch bolt started. And the 3/8 bolt in the front. This is non-ethanol fuel. So I got fuel in it. Before I try to crank it, let's check out the primer bulb. And it is working. You can see that fuel shooting in. All right, here we go. Well, we'll never know why this mower was pushed to the side or how long it went without running, but we do know that it was long enough for the air filter to literally turn to dust. If I had to guess, I would say the fouled spark plug or maybe a bad diaphragm caused the engine not to start, and then they just pushed it to the side and left it. But you saw everything I did in the video to get it running again, and now it runs fine. I hope this helps you out. Thanks for watching.